When I was younger, I used to have some people might have referred to as sleeping problems. For the most part, I was a relatively well-behaved child. I got good grades, obeyed my parents and finished all my chores. I was never able to turn off the boundless energy that seemed to power my body, even when lying stationary in my bed. There was just something so exciting about how the thin crescent of the glowing moon peeked in through the half-drawn curtains, like an opening eye. There was always more to do and see at night, and I wanted to map out every inch of the darkness. I have no idea how my poor parents coped. Children are always a handful at that age, but I'm surprised that I didn't drive the two of them completely insane. No matter how many times they put me to bed, they would always wake up to a tugging on the bed covers and find me standing there. In the mornings, they were both barely conscious. My mother's foundation would be smeared across her face in an attempt to conceal the dark bags, as big as gunny sacks, that hung under her eyelids, while my father's face drooped further into a cereal bowl, his half-undone tie already soaking in milk. All the while, I would remain as chipper and alert as ever, as if I'd had a full 8 hours of sleep, bemused at the strange behavior of my parents. They tried everything: bargaining, punishment, and even promising me treats and toys if I just slept one full night. But nothing seemed to work. Both were at their wits' end. But neither of them refused to give in. They removed anything electronic from my room. The only sources of light that permeated my room was the glow of the illuminated upstairs through the crack in my bedroom door and the hanging moon outside my bedroom window. An armchair was positioned outside my door, and my parents would take regular shifts every night sitting in it to make sure that I didn't get out. In the end, I was effectively trapped in my room. My body felt like it would explode with all the pent-up energy I needed to move. It was on just such a night where I was mapping out the cracks that lined my ceiling, 38 in total. I shifted around, my restless limbs crinkling the sheets which felt like lead on top of me. A soft snore caught my ears. I craned my neck into the narrowed view of the door. My dad, who had been assigned to my watch this night, was slumped over the side of the chair, mouth open. A hurricane could have torn through the house and he would have probably stepped through it all. My heart pounded with equal parts fear and excitement as I swung a cautious leg over the edge of my bed. I cringed at the low creak of the floorboards as I stepped out. A sudden rustle from outside my heart completely stopped altogether. I waited for the lights to flick on and my father's angry voice to blare in. After a few seconds frozen in fear, I forced myself to look outside once more. My attentions were drawn to the shuddering branches of one tree that stood amongst the bristling tips of the forest clearing. Even though it was pitch black out there, I swore that it hadn't been there during the day. It was only when it stood up that I realized that it wasn't a tree at all. I stared, mouth open, as the shapeless form unfurled into a gigantic humanoid figure, who arched its bony arms into the twinkling light of the distant stars, its elongated fingers extending just far enough to graze the pale underbelly of the moon. Its eyes fluttered open. It had no pupils or irises, just pure, mesmerizing white whose brightness rivaled the moon above. I was so transfixed by the sight that I didn't notice the shape was getting bigger, its luminous eyes expanding until I was almost blinded. It glided silently through the night on stilt-like limbs, the trees parting around each step of its immense legs. My heart vaulted into my mouth as it dawned on me. It had seen me. It was coming. As I was about to make a run for it, a sharp bang sent me flailing backwards. It stood right outside my window, staring in at me. My bedroom was on the second floor, yet it had to crane its neck to peer through. It had to be at least 20 feet tall, but it lacked the mass one would associate with a being of that size. It was morbidly thin, almost fleshless, its bare ribcage glinting out in the night like a corpse in the desert, long picked clean by ravenous carrion. The rest of its body was shrouded in shadow, apart from the unnatural light of its eyes, that pulled in like twin spotlights. Any screams for help I could have let out were sealed inside my throat. I couldn't even breathe. Somehow, the thing's very presence seemed to suck my very voice out of my body. After a few minutes of glowering in, motionless, it raised a massive clawed hand. Its silvery skin of its sinuous arm shimmered up in the faint light. It looked metallic, resembling a metal coil. Yet its movements were too fluid and organic to be anything mechanical. Then, it dragged the serrated tips of its fingers down the glass at a nails-on chalkboard pitch. I dove into my bed and buried myself under my blankets, desperate to escape its unremitting stare, abiding by the old "it can't see you if you can't see it" childhood logic. But the hideous sound echoed through my ears, a permanent reminder of its presence. The scratches seemed to grow louder by the second, as if at any moment it would break through the glass and drag me out of my bed into the inky black beyond, never to be seen again. My body, half curled into the fetal position, was shaking so badly that my brain could barely form a coherent thought. All I wanted for whatever it was to disappear, for this whole thing to end. Someone out there must have heard my desperate pleas. Just then, the trailing headlights of a car rushed down the road. The creature recoiled at the sight, distracted from its tormenting of me. It scratched at its face with a muffled howl, as if the light burned it. Just before it passed our house, it reverted onto all fours and raced away like a rabid greyhound into the safety of the nearby woods. I lay frozen underneath the cocooning bedclothes, too afraid to even flinch in case my slightest movement would draw the creature back again. Somehow in my all-consuming terror, I managed to find the respite of sleep. It was the first entire night that I'd stayed in my own bed. Even as the smiling sun warmed the glass, I still refused to dip even a toe out of my bed. It was only after summoning every remaining ounce of courage in my body and the groaning of my stomach that I managed to creep down the stairs. As I made my way to the kitchen to fetch myself a bowl of cereal, I tried to dismiss the whole thing as just a particularly vivid sleep paralysis experience. But those glowing eyes seemed to be burned into my mind. Every time I blinked, I saw them. My parents were already down there. Although both had slept better than they had in a long time, their faces were pale and drawn, exchanging fearful, frantic whispers that ceased the moment they realized I was standing in the doorway. I froze, thinking I was in trouble. Mom, her eyes reddened and puffy, rose from the table and hugged me hard enough to knock the air from my lungs. Dad had to pry her hands away from my sides before I suffocated completely. It turns out that I was the lucky one. Just a few houses down from ours, on that very same night, an 8-year-old girl by the name of Janice Suarez had vanished. I'd attended a few of her prior birthday parties, along with the other neighborhood kids. Her mother had come into her room after hearing her cry out in the middle of the night, to comfort her from the nightmare she'd assumed she'd been having. When she'd switched on the lights, she'd found her daughter's bed empty. Once the police had been called, they had scoured every inch of the house and the surrounding acres but had found no trace of Janice. They never did. The only soluble clue to her disappearance had been the window that her mother had left open the night before, the white strawberry patterned curtain still flapping in the morning breeze. Graduating college was perhaps the most confusing and terrifying time of my life. Once the initial elation ebbed away, I was left with an uncertain void. Where do I go from here? What do I do with my life? Realizing that my student loans weren't going to pay off themselves, I took a job while I tried to figure out what to do. It was part of a large, well-known franchise that many of you have probably shopped at, but I will leave nameless as I don't want to give it any bad publicity. It wasn't easy. There are long hours and a never-ending stream of rude, entitled customers who believed that the world owed them a favor. Still, I persevered through it all for that glorious pay. But it wasn't the hell on earth that some people assume it is. I met a lot of good people there, some whose numbers are saved in my phone to this very day. I got on well with most of my coworkers, but Annie was the closest thing to a friend that I had. She was a true veteran, having started there as a part-timer in her college years and was now heading into her early 40s. Her voice never rose above a dry monotone, even when a belligerent tracksuited soccer mom was literally screaming in her face. She was a plump, aloof woman with faint streaks of gray already lining her black bobbed hair. Her face wore heavy lines, battle scars from a long fight with life, but she still managed to stand tall. The smell of stale cigarettes always wafted about her, along with the lavender perfume she downed herself with to try to mask her pack-a-day habit. It was her that took me under her wing and showed me the ropes. I still wonder what she saw in me. Maybe the sight of me, fresh-faced in my uniform with my name tag pinned to my chest like a Medal of Honor, reminded her of her own younger, novice days and felt compelled to be the guardian that she'd never had. It had been a few months after I had started my job, on a relatively slow Thursday, where I had been in the clothing aisle, refolding the clothes that the customers had haphazardly discarded on the floors of the changing rooms. Annie had been a shelf down, providing an example for me to follow from. We'd spent the good part of the hour chatting and joking to each other. As I had been hanging a sweater on a hanger, a wooden clack drew closer from down the aisle. I peered out and saw an old woman hobbling down. She was a sweet, grandmotherly type, her snow-white bun tied up in a flowery pink babushka with a faded red shawl draped over her shoulders and the long gray skirt she wore trailing over her slipper-wearing feet. Her plump face smiled out at the world, wrinkles hanging off her skin like the webbing skin on hot milk. She looked like the kind that would have a freshly baked tray of cookies waiting for you on the kitchen counter whenever you came over to see her and send you hand-knitted gifts every Christmas. I watched her shuffle down into the children's section, where she paused to inspect a tiny Disney princess emblazoned t-shirt. I figured that she was looking for a present for her granddaughter and fixed on my best customer service smile. But before I could take a single step towards her, Annie barged into my peripheral vision. She wrenched me away from the arm and dragged me behind the nearest coat rack, far out of the woman's peripheral vision. She faced me, her lips compressed into a tight line. "No. Not her," she hissed. Her tone was low and urgent as she jabbed a finger into the air towards the still turned back of the woman. I stared at her, dumbstruck. What? But she's just some old lady. She frantically shushed me, her grip on my arm tightening to a near bone-crushing degree. "Do not talk to her. Don't even look at her. Just stay as far away from her as you can." The seriousness on Annie's face was enough to make me avoid the woman until 2 hours later, when she hobbled out the shifting doors. I knew how unreasonable I was being. I just couldn't understand it. The old woman looked like the kind of person that would let a fly buzz about her home rather than swatting it. When I tried to ask my other co-workers about it, they reacted just as bizarrely. The color would drain from their faces when I described the woman to them. They would either quickly change the subject or just avoid my questions. One of them even became belligerent when I refused to let the matter go and refused to speak to me for an entire day afterward. She would come in like clockwork, at the same time every day, and stay for a few hours before leaving. If they encountered her, then they would just walk around her and ignore her pleas, as if her presence was invisible to them. My heart ached for her. I wanted nothing more to help her, but Annie's hawk-like gaze was always a few feet away. She limped on a cane with eggshell brittle legs and always addressed those around her as young man or young woman. The lady seemed like the most inoffensive being who had ever walked this planet. So, what could she have done that made them all shun her? In the end, peer pressure won out over my better instincts, and I too learned to stay away from her. It was at the end of another long, hard-working day, after the last few straggling shoppers had vacated the store, that I was able to stretch my aching limbs. I wanted nothing more than to go home and binge-watch Netflix on my bed until I passed out. "Good work today, kiddo," Annie called over with an approving nod. I flushed, filled with pride. "Thanks," I stuttered. When I wore the badge and work uniform, I became a part of something bigger than myself, an almost symbiotic entity. But it was only now that I really began to feel like I was part of the team. I exited the door with a newfound perk in my step, knowing all my hard work was paying off. Just as I was checking on my phone how far away my Uber ride was, I heard it. "Young lady?" The wheedling tone almost sent my phone slipping from my hand. I knew that voice, along with the familiar sound of a wooden walking stick. It was one that I had heard almost every day. I creaked my head slightly around my neck, just far enough to make out the pink covering tied around the old woman's diminutive head. It was long past closing time, when any customers should have been about. What was she doing here at night? Didn't she have a home or anyone to look after her? "I'm sorry to bother you, young lady," she continued, "but I appear to have lost my way. Could you help me get home?" An uneasy chill prickled down my spine. I snapped my head around, trying to distract myself with the glowing white screen of my phone. The old woman kept talking, her tone growing more distraught. "I'm so cold, I don't know where I am, and I just want to go home." Her voice verged on tears. "Please. Please. Help me." I couldn't take it anymore. Despite every cell in my body screaming at me not to, I turned around. To hell with Annie, I thought, to hell with everyone. I was going to help her. It turned out to be the worst decision of my life. Once our eyes met, her face changed. I can barely begin to describe it. Her eyes lolled back into her sockets, leaving pure white, and her wrinkled mouth stretched into a hideous grin, exposing dozens of rows of black, needle-like teeth. She lunged on top of me, pinning to the ground with a surprising strength for someone of her age and size. Despite being at least 60 years younger than her withered hands held my wrists to the ground with vice-like grip. She tore off the pink babushka, allowing me to see her real face. Her cheeks were covered in blackened lesions, from which yellowish pus seeped from. The putrid smell of rotting meat filled my nostrils. The skin looked like it was rotting, with holes so deep that I could see the glint of exposed bone. Huge, malformed teeth jutted out of the holes in her withered gray flesh. Her pale pink gums bubbled with saliva, which splashed down onto my cheek, our faces just inches away. She unhinged her jaws, wider than any human was capable of, until the bottom of her chin touched her sternum, exposing her ribbed, pink-gullet and lolling scarlet tongue, which on closer inspection, saw another miniature-toothed mouth at the end of. I felt myself being sucked into her maw by every exhale she made, as if she was a human black hole, that seemed to vacuum up any screams for help as well. I was convinced that I was going to die there, but before my head was completely pulled in, there was a sharp crack of bone. The old woman threw back her head with a pained howl. Annie stood behind her, wielding a shovel that I recognized from the gardening section of the store. She brought it down again on the creature's spine with even more force, sending it sprawling to the ground, releasing me from its clutches. But Annie wasn't done with it yet. She set upon it with such fury that I heard the splinter of the wooden handle. It wailed even louder, reaching a hellish, high-pitched squall. "Told you not to look at it," she puffed out with each blow. Annie stood in front of me, brandishing the gardening tool like a sword, raised out defiantly towards whatever it was. It scowled back at her, thick, black, tar-like blood slithering down the thin bridge of its nose from the massive wound on its forehead. "Get the hell out of here!" she roared at it. With one final hiss, the old woman scampered away into the night. We stood there for a few tepid seconds, Annie still with the shovel gripped in hand, fearing that it would come back. When it became clear that it wasn't, Annie collapsed against the wall, doubling over with a throaty cough. I burst into tears, in both relief and horror at what had just transpired, my sobs so violent it felt like I was suffocating. Though still annoyed, Annie knelt to me, her hand rubbing small, soothing circles into my back while she murmured words of comfort. "You alright?" she asked. "It didn't touch you?" I shook my head. Annie sagged in relief down beside me. The metal spade of the shovel clattered against the concrete. "Thank God," she breathed. "Didn't think I'd do it that much damage. It always comes back, no matter what you throw at it. I just couldn't stand by and let it take another one." I didn't stay at the job for much longer after that.